Welcome back to another episode of Creative Finance Playbook. I'm your host, Joe Delafave, and today we're going to be talking about why we passed on a 7-unit apartment building in New York that we got under contract with seller financing with only $5,000 down. And I know what you're thinking, wow, how is this even possible, right? Well, I'll go over the story real quick and tell you why we passed on it. So we had a seller reach out to us recently. She bought a 7-unit apartment building. She's an investor, but she lives out of state. She lives in Colorado. And she reached out and says, she bought this apartment building and it's been really full of challenges. She bought it sight unseen. She's never even been to New York. So when she bought it, she was relying on the agent and everything like that to help her with this. Now she closes on the property. She puts $100,000 down. Not only did she put $100,000 down, but she put another $75,000 into the property. She had a home equity line of credit on her personal home that she borrowed against to put in like paint and redoing some of the units in there. And then that's when the things started really happening. She didn't have a property manager. She was relying on the real estate agent to help find her some tenants. So the agent was just bringing in some tenants. 5 out of the 7 units were occupied. He helped her fill the last 2. She thought life was great. Well, it wasn't. First, her rent was under market value. So she wasn't charging the full amount of rent for the area. Number one thing, right? Number 2, she didn't know the area that she was buying in. So she was buying in a D- area. What does that mean, Joe? It's a rough neighborhood. This is one of the parts of New York where I'm very familiar with, and it is full of challenges of high crime, drugs, prostitutions, all car thefts. It's all the things happening in the area. So it's a rough part of town. So when she's buying this sight unseen, she doesn't know the area. She's got a lot of money invested into the deal. Now she puts in some new renters, and the new renters are not paying rent. So now she's having to go through the eviction process in New York. And that's a very long, challenging thing. And the tenants were very challenging, even getting them out. Months and months and months of not collecting rent. But meanwhile, she's paying this big payment every single month. Well, these tenants kind of trashed some of the units inside the building. And then after they finally got removed, they kept coming back and smashing windows and things like that. So right away, could she have benefited from a property management? Sure, but she was done. She wanted to sell it, and that's why she reached out to us. So we started looking a little bit more into the deal because when we negotiated with her, she said that she didn't have the money to pay the property or the school taxes that are due in the fall. And so she's like, if you could give me $5,000 down so I could pay the taxes and you guys cover closing costs, you guys could have the deal. She was going to give us I think it was a 10-year term, had a pretty decent rate on the actual property itself. So now it's time to do our due diligence. So I sent over some of my contractor friends and some of my real estate investing friends to take a look at the property. So here's what we found out why we passed on it. Number one, she paid way too much for the property, right? Many of these units in here were 1-bedroom apartments, where most of the 1-bedroom apartments in that area were selling for about $30,000 per apartment, right? And so what we found out by just putting some math to it, she should have bought this property from the MLS for probably around $225, maybe the top of the range she should have spent on it was maybe $250. She bought it for $325. So she definitely overpaid for the property. Now this was in 2022 when a lot of that was going on. Fast forward now, she definitely overpaid for it. Then she put $75,000 worth of renovations into the property. So she definitely now made it what she thought was going to be nicer, but all that got destroyed by the tenants living in there. So she's all in between management that she's not paying for, but buying it, closing costs, all the expenses, holding costs, the renovations. She's all in around $400,000. Now she knows she's going to take a loss. So when she reached out to us, she says, I'm willing to sell it for $350,000 with $5,000 down, and we just cover the closing costs. So at first, I'm all excited. Lexi calls me because she was working with the seller in the beginning. And I'm like, wow, this sounds like an incredible deal. But then once we started doing the math, by the time you were to get the rent minus the repairs that it's going to need, all of the expenses of property management and the maintenance and the repairs and the upkeep. It's an older building. It definitely needed some work. It's seen its better days a long time ago. And it just needs to get brought back to life. But unfortunately, because of her overpaying for it, means that I'm not going to overpay for it. And even if it's a deal where I'm only able to get into the deal for $5,000 down, what I do is I look at what's called the cost of entry, which is $5,000 down plus some closing costs, plus my renovations. And then what am I going to rent all 7 units for? I'm going to need a property manager to manage this because I'm not going to be managing that. I'm going to need somebody who's familiar with that area. And when you start adding up the expenses, I would lose money every single month just to say I own it. So sometimes you're going to have a seller reach out to you and say, yes, I will do seller financing, but maybe it's just not a great deal. Maybe they're in a pickle, right? And there's many of these situations where we could put these deals together and make them work, right? We're savvy, we're investors, we have a lot of friends and other people who can maybe help us on those deals. But this one was just too full of challenges. So we ended up passing on the deal. Now I know the seller in her situation, because I have a local real estate management friend. And he said, oh my gosh, I told him about the story and I told him the unit. He's like, I know her and I know the property. And here's what's really going on. The seller wasn't telling us. So when they say the term buyers are liars, well, sellers are even worse because there was a list of things going on over there that seller did not disclose to us. And what we were going to end up doing was making her problem our problem in that situation. So we ended up passing on the deal. So what were our big takeaways from that? One, I like to buy properties where I'm familiar with the area. And if I'm going to be either, hiring a property management company, are those the areas I want to invest in? And when I was young and I was watching my parents invest in some of their multifamily in the beginning, they were in these neighborhoods. And my gosh, it is just full of challenges. And maybe you're looking for your first deal. Is that where you want to invest in, right? So for me, what I've learned is I generally like heading out to the suburbs, where it is just a little bit easier to do it. And many times too, I'm still got to make sure that the deal works, right? So my saying is, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. I got my cash flow shirt on today. I got to be able to buy the property, and all the money invested into it, I need to make that back by 2 ways, 3 ways, really. I get to write off depreciation, which is great. I want to be able to cash flow. I need to have money coming in every month. So if a hot water tank goes, or if I got to replace a broken window or anything like that, that's what that revenue does. And then obviously appreciation. I want the property to go up in value. But in this area, there really isn't much appreciation. So now if there's really not much appreciation, I'm only going to bank on cash flow. And there was zero cash flow to be had here by the time I pay the underlying debt with taking over her existing mortgage, by the time I'm paying insurance, property management, and now maintenance. By the time I do all of that, I would have been losing money. So it could have been what I thought in the beginning was a beautiful deal, but not every deal is, right? So this is why it's very important to make sure one thing is super important when you're looking at a deal. You need to do your due diligence. You need to analyze the deal. You have to figure out every little single thing to make sure you don't get into a bad deal, guys. And for me, I'd rather pass on a deal that's a little bit tight or a little bit questionable than make it and regret it later on. So for me, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And I need to make sure that I'm able to make money from the deal, because also too, there's things that happen. I just got a bill on one of my rentals, a different property that we owned it for years. Well, come to find out, the roof looks great, but there was a part around the chimney that water's getting in, and I'm getting a big bill that I have to replace that. So that cash flow, that money that you're setting aside, is going to help pay for those repairs. If you do rent to own, well, then your renters are going to be responsible for those things. But either way, you got to bring in that cash flow, have a savings account, start stocking away that money. So if there's ever an event that there's a situation like that, you've got something to cover yourself. So for me, I would rather pass on that deal. And unfortunately, I did explain it to the seller what was going on. I did explain that I did do a little research and I found out, a couple extra things. And she's like, oh yeah, that's true too. So she definitely knew that she wasn't fully disclosing everything about that property. So big things. Just because a seller says yes to terms doesn't mean it's a deal for you as the buyer, right? So make sure you're doing your due diligence. And this is one thing I can't stress enough. I've heard from so many investors where they bought a deal and now they're just bleeding out money everywhere. And it's a scary thing. So you want to make sure you're doing this right. So if a seller says yes, it's exciting. Make sure before you sign on that dotted line, you've covered all of your bases to make sure this is something either you want to handle or it is profitable, or if it's not and the numbers aren't making sense, or you got that gut feeling, or you've even shared the deal with some of your investor friends and you've got some feedback and you see some red flags, maybe that's a chance you might want to pass on that deal and just not make it. And there's nothing wrong with that too. I wish we could make every deal the seller say yes. And I've got a lot right now where a seller's saying yes to terms. They will do seller financing. So some of these are beautiful turnkey properties, but they don't cash flow. If they don't cash flow, I'm not buying them. So words to live by. If it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. Make deals, but make great deals, guys. And the way you do that, by generating a lot of leads. So get some leads coming to you, look at the deals and make the good ones, right? But pass on the bad ones. Well, stay tuned. We got a lot more coming. If you want to learn more about this, creativefinanceplaybook.com. Download our amazing script of how the questions we ask sellers and get yourself a deal. Well, stay tuned for more, guys. Thank you for tuning in and have a wonderful day.